Well, welcome back to another episode of the Addy Hour. It's been a while. It's been a few months, so I'm really excited to be able to host another great conversation. And today I'm honored and thrilled to be able to welcome Joanne, Coach P. McCallie to the Addy Hour podcast. Coach P, thank you so much for being here. Definitely appreciate it.
Thank you. It's always great to be amongst a Dookie.
Yeah.
That's always a good thing.
Yeah, definitely a good connection there. And for me, I'll have to contain my excitement because, as our listeners know, I'm a Duke fan, avid Duke fan, and Duke graduate. So this is a full circle moment for me to be able to host you after watching you on the sidelines for so many years. And definitely appreciate just all the work that you're doing as well.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Excellent. And by way of introduction, I just want to give our listeners a little bit of background about who you are and what you've been up to the last few years. But of course, that's something we'll delve into in the conversation as well. But Joanne, Coach P. McCallie is a former NCAA Division I women's basketball coach, a position that she held for 28 years. And as she talks about, she's now taken on her greatest role yet. So she's forging a path to destigmatizing mental health and coaching those afflicted by mental health challenges to pass for a full and productive life. As I mentioned, Coach P has a history as an elite coach and a champion. She's led teams at Maine, Michigan State, and most importantly, Duke. Not really, but from my perspective, most importantly, Duke, making National Coach of the Year and winning numerous championships at all three schools. She's the only coach in history to win Coach of the Year in 4 different conferences, and she achieved that 5 times. She's also the only Division I head coach to lead 2 different programs to 30-win seasons and 3 national championship game appearances. So someone who has obviously excelled in her craft. But she's also a winner in life with a powerful story as someone who was diagnosed with bipolar disorder at the age of 30 while coaching at Maine. It was something she wanted to reveal for decades, but she was counseled otherwise because of concerns of the consequences that it might have for her career and on her teams. And even despite these struggles, she also had a bout with skin cancer, but still successfully raised a family and continued to triumph in basketball. But in 2021, she decided it was time to shift and to talk and become a mental health advocate and speaker, sharing her story to inspire and educate others on how to win without losing yourself. The result of her work has been a best-selling book, Secret Warrior, a coach and fighter on and off the court, something we'll talk about a little bit more today. And she's also the author of Choice, Not Chance, Rules for Building a Fierce Competitor. So again, I'm just deeply honored to be able to host Coach P here. I'm grateful for all the work that you're doing in these spaces. And outside of even the mental health component, all the things that you do around mentorship is also something that's very near and dear to my heart personally and in my professional and academic roles. So I'm sure there's lots we could talk about on this podcast, but we won't make the conversation go too long, but I'm just honored to be able to welcome you here today.
It's thrilling. I love it. And I love the work that you do. I admire work in brain health so much.
Well, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. And in a sense, I feel like the conversation that we're having these are the types of things that have been really gratifying for me, even as a neuroscientist, to be able to have these partnerships and these conversations so that we don't just get stuck in our silos, working on what we're working in isolation when it has so much importance and impact for our society in general. So I appreciate your willingness to come in for us to be able to engage that, to model it, and hopefully to move things forward in a very real way.
Well, the podcast is fabulous. The diversity of your cast. I mean, everyone's got to be thrilled about that.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun and a lot of learning and growth for me as well.
Great.
Well, as my listeners know, they're anticipating this. I always just like to check in with people and see how people are doing just in the midst of everything that we're experiencing. Obviously, we all have our personal joys and challenges that we walk through on a day-to-day basis. But at this point in time, October of 2022, we also have elections that are coming up in the U.S., all the tensions around that. There are obviously things that are continuing to go on all over the world, in Russia and Ukraine, the challenges that have come up in Iran recently with some of the women's rights issues that we're still trying to see if things will change for Brittany Griner coming back to the country, obviously just to name a few. But I always just like to put things in context and just see how you're navigating on a day-to-day basis with all things personally in your life and just on the world stage.
I think, well, you mentioned Brittany, and she's a fabulous person, and what she did at Baylor was incredible. I didn't know her personally. I don't know her personally, but she was the reason why we didn't go to a Final Four.
Yeah,
She had a 3-point play in Memphis that knocked us out. And Coach K and the guys, John Shire and Nolan, they all went. And so we made it as far as the Elite Eight together, but we didn't quite get to that Final Four.
Right. I remember that well.
Yeah. Good times, though. A lot of success. And getting back to Brittany, I keep trying to think about prayers and thoughts that she's a strong, she's strong. And I know this is the biggest challenge of her life. And I can't imagine. And the world stage in all regards is very difficult. And I try to focus in my world to do what I can for mental health advocacy and understanding mental health impairment and trying to motivate and guide the best I can, being a non-medical expert, but just definitely learning a lot in 27 years.
That's really well said. And I appreciate just walking us through your thoughts and concern in the midst of the work that you're doing for Brittany and that whole situation, but just also thinking about how you're making an impact. And it's interesting for me to hear you speak as a coach. I mean, you're not coaching anymore in that sense, but to kind of hear how that has translated into what you're doing now and the ways that you're continuing to coach in a sense with a different or maybe an overlapping mission. So again, for me, that's really encouraging. But before we delve into that a little bit, just wanted to have you also just take our listeners through your path and how you got into coaching in the first place. And I guess we'll get to touching in to the way that you're coaching in society right now too. But just curious to hear about your general path.
Well, I was very blessed with great mentors and leadership on all accounts. I was down at Auburn as a graduate assistant, became an assistant coach. I learned from Joe Champy at Auburn, Pat Summit, Sue Gunter, fabulous people. And I was a head coach at 26 because I'd had that exposure to the Final Fours, national championship, became that head coach at 26. And I read all of Coach K's books. I hadn't met him or anything, but there weren't as many books out at that time. And so I'm a Navy brat and, he's an Army person. So I was really pulled to that story. And so that's when I started studying Mike and Coach K and all of that. And I had 8 years at Maine and 7 at Michigan State. And that's where I bumped into Tom Izzo. And we actually did go to Final Four the same year.
Right.
And that was quite an experience. And I learned a great deal from him. And being working alongside Coach K for 13 years was quite an experience. And so I've been very gifted. I've been very fortunate and blessed to have incredible mentors along the way.
That's outstanding and great to hear. I'm curious, 26 as a head coach, was that surprising at that time? Was it an anomaly? Just thinking back to landscape, I'm curious what your experience was like at that point.
At that time I was the youngest. I think the youngest ever was Pat. I think Pat was like 22.
Wow.
I admire her greatly, and I can't believe what she went through with her brain. I just, you can't imagine or even fathom that. But I think at the time I was the youngest Division I head coach, and I was coming home to Maine. I'm from Maine, and so that was an enormous amount of pressure to be in your home state, and some of that pressure contributed to my episode in finding out that I was, in fact, somebody with bipolar disorder. So I guess there's that awful experience, but yet at the same time, I believe in the concept of the brilliant mind. And I do believe that if you seek balance, whatever balance you need to seek, that you will be your best ever. And so many people don't know that they can get through it.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. Definitely something I want us to come back to in the conversation as well, because one of the things that has come up on this podcast and just in conversations is that idea, as you talked about, getting back to a place of balance, but the idea of separating mental health from mental wellness. And this idea that you don't have to you can have a mental illness and still have mental wellness.
Absolutely.
And at the same time, you can not have a mental illness and not have mental wellness in terms of the day-to-day activities, how people are spending their time. So really helping us as a society to think about things that way and not to just put those of us who are struggling into a specific category of condemnation or struggling or hopelessness, but to really kind of have that piece. And that's one of the things I've really appreciated with what you've been sharing with folks as well on this journey.
Well, it's as you know, and of course I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's a continuum. And what I feel about the continuum is it's become much more blurred. And now whatever was good for me, back in the day, and I realized bipolar disorder might be 5%, I don't know, we don't know because many are undiagnosed, but let's say 4%. The reality is my ability to relate is 100%, given what we've been through. And so sharing tips and ideas, whether it's a simple tip about sleep hygiene or something more complicated, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, whatever it is, we're on more of a continuum for it. So I guess that's a good thing. It's more blended. And as you know, brain health does not discriminate. I mean, it hits all ages and all races and ethnicities and everything. And I think that's the thing actually that is a great example to many other things in our world. Is that we have to come together. It's a human thing. It's a human element. And I think has some irony in it. Given all the, segmenting that's going on. And I think that's very sad.
I think there's a huge opportunity there and a lot of power as well if we keep that human lens on things and use it as a way to bring us together towards a common goal, as much as it can be used to go the opposite direction as well, as a way to continue to divide people. So I think that's really, really important point that you brought up as well. Just to loop back a little bit, as much as you're willing to share, if you'd be willing to give our listeners some insight, you talked about the mentorship, about the pressure going back to your home state and the first episode. If as much as you're willing to share how that all came about, because I think it's also very informative for people to be able to hear a bit of a journey and to have some understanding, because I think bipolar is one of those things that unless someone has walked with someone through it, sometimes it's hard for people to grasp or get a concrete sense of what that really entails.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to diagnose, isn't it? It's a tough one. What I can say is I was 30. It was a year after giving birth to my first child. And we were getting that program, wanting to go to the highest level and all of that. I had a lot of pride in being from Maine, coming back. The program was sort of bottomed out at the time. So it was a wonderful opportunity. And I took it very seriously. And so seriously that I lost a dear friend, was coaching, and then stopped sleeping. And I didn't think that was a big deal. I thought I was getting older, didn't need as much sleep, and that actually it gave me more time to think and work and do. And my husband was not aware of that I had sort of not had 2 or 3 nights sleep. I said I didn't sleep well. But he, what does that mean?
Right.
Remember, this is 27 years ago. There isn't a thought in the world about brain health, sleep hygiene, any of those things. Not in the way it is today. And so I thought, wow, this is good. I can be really efficient and productive. And then I think the 4th or 5th night, you don't crash. You just, as you know, the mania accelerates. And the interesting part about it was I was very good in front of my team because I was very positive. I was projecting championships and great things for the program. I was organized and on it. And if you came to practice, you would have said, wow, what an enthusiastic, organized coach. The positivity was through the roof. So they were taking that in. But I was fortunate. It was sort of over a weekend, I believe, where my husband and a couple other friends recognized that I was losing reality. And the biggest part that is in my trailer is I'm talking to a recruit on the phone. And I tell her that the TD is talking to us, talking to me and to her. And this is on my trailer, which I present when I speak. And she was a great kid and chose the University of Maine, which is an interesting caveat.
Wow. Yeah.
And she said, what do you mean, Coach P? I said, no, I'm telling you, it's telling us, great things. And before I could get into a long conversation, John grabbed the phone and he said, Jamie, Coach P's just having a moment here. Wow. And we'll call you back. And so that's how that started. And then my husband had to trick me, so to speak, that we were going for a drive to take me to a hospital. And then I deducted, there's something wrong with him. So in my weird paranoia, I started to think about, wow, what's wrong with him? So I happily went to this psychiatric hospital.
Mm-hmm.
I said, boy, we have to take care of him. And the reality didn't hit me until they shut the door.
Mm.
It's done differently now.
Mm-hmm.
But what I had to go through was a little bit different.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like a one flew over the cuckoo's nest kind of thing.
Mm.
And the door shut. And then I realized I couldn't get out. And so that's, there's this whole scene in the book that I cover about being locked in. And I run around trying to get out. And they had to, tackle me and, the shots and the whole thing. And so I try to, things have come a long way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we should be very proud of that.
Yeah.
Of where it's come. And so that was my first episode. And then just very quickly, my second episode was only because I stopped taking my meds because I thought I was better.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an athlete, didn't want to take any medicine. And my doctor said, if you do that, you probably will struggle at the time you don't want to struggle the most.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't believe that. But sure enough, in February, in the middle of the season, I had a depressive episode. And most people think a depressive episode is, feeling way down, but it's also you can't read the newspaper. As you know, you can't function. I couldn't write up a play.
Mm-hmm.
It just was not happening for me. And then I couldn't coach in a game. My jaw locked up. I had an allergic reaction. And long story is I had to bring this team in and tell them that I had let them down and that I hadn't taken care of myself. And after that, when I did that, and the good news is we won a championship that year. This one, we did lose that. We did lose that game by 30 points, and because the women knew something was wrong with me.
Yeah.
And so that was my story then. And I've had a third episode, and ironically, that was after leaving Duke, after getting out of coaching completely.
Wow.
I think that's significant because people think, oh, it's all this pressure that forces these things. And if that's the case, I do have one example of that, my first episode. But my third, I was on vacation. Different story.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to recognize the complicated nature of it all.
Yeah. Wow, that was really well said. And I mean, again, just appreciate your level of candor and so many important lessons that you even just talked through and talking through your experience. I mean, thinking about the way that your husband, that family stepped in and was looking out for you and paying attention. I mean, that's such a key point for those who are willing and able to actually notice differences and then to be proactive and help you navigate through that. But then also just even on your part, just the humbling experience that it must have been, even as the realization was coming along different ways, as you talked about your first experience at the hospital or things that have happened since then, the aspects of resilience that you had to show, but then also just navigating, knowing how to navigate, having one experience, not taking medication, how that impacted you. So, I mean, so many important lessons that you just shared, even in just walking us through that so candidly, which I think is important. And then even that, I mean, that last example about the vacation, again, just the complexity of these challenges and that it's not always predictable, not what people may think. So I appreciate you taking through that. And for those who haven't heard or have that concrete aspect, I think it's just really helpful to even hear what that looks like. Because in so many situations, like you mentioned with the coaching, the manic side is just hard for people to grasp because it looks so productive in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it does. And it feels that way. And, what's really marked by my experience is a death. If you go back to my first experience, it was the pressure of being a coach and it was the death of a dear friend and supporter. And all of that kind of went in a direction. And the timelines aren't always clear as you reflect backwards. And then interestingly, upon leaving Duke in July of 2020, my episode does not occur until June of 21. But yet I have a cancer scare. I have a hysterectomy. And then October 18th, which is today, this is 2 years, my father passed. So I had my father passing and I sort of made it through. I made it around all these responsibilities and different things going on. And then I was going up to Michigan and on vacation. And it was the human connection piece that was costing me. I had lost a lot of supporters that loved me because I was with Duke. Well, I wasn't with Duke anymore.
Yeah.
And so, and that's not being negative towards people. That's human nature.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wasn't associated with Duke. And so my commonality kind of wasn't there as much. Your circle gets a little smaller.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I had a dear friend really step away, that I thought was a mentor for me. And so human connection broke.
Yeah. And
when that broke, that, was interesting. And then again, I was in a psychiatric hospital, Munson in northern Michigan, by Traverse City. But what I will say, to go full circle on the story, is the care that I received there versus the 26-year care was extraordinary.
Wow.
It was. I mean, I could actually be cognizant of that in my journey.
Yeah. Yeah. So important. I mean, just another thread of community that's coming through as well, too. Just the positive aspects of community, but also what happens when community is lost. Because in a sense, it almost sounds like, maybe this is too far, but you were going through, I'm not being clinical here, but almost a mourning process of losing some connections and re-navigating. Yeah. And that's something we talk about a lot. Not something I've looked to in terms of bipolar, but just the importance of community in general with mental health, how it can be protective, how it can help people navigate. So all those shifts in community, losing your father, which I'm sorry to hear about as well, but all those aspects too, which are foundational and which can also add a level of stress. So again, I know you said you're speaking as a non-clinician, but I think it's so helpful the ways that you're pulling on all these different pieces and how they've impacted you. Because I think that's just helpful for listeners to hear as they or their loved ones may be going through things and thinking about how those things and shifts and moves can actually have impact. Sometimes in ways that I think people don't want to necessarily acknowledge right away for fear of maybe appearing weak or not strong enough, but they all have impacts. And again, me speaking as a neuroscientist, knowing that those things have impacts on our brains and how we navigate. So I mean, I'm just appreciating the way that you're articulating that and talking through it and giving life to it in a way that I think will be life-giving to people who are listening as well.
Well, I hope so. And I think that I've always, live deeply, think deeply, feel deeply. There's a wonderful, I guess that's a wonderful thing, but you add that to rumination and you add that to loss and grieving and not to mention my hormonal changes. I was no longer going to have children, but that's emptying out. I mean, that is where everything goes. Yeah. And that's a very strange dynamic. And the other thing that, again, not being a doctor, but it's interesting that a hormonal shift, a big one, led to a third episode. Yeah. And a hormonal shift, a birth, led to an episode at almost exactly the same months.
Wow.
Apart.
Yeah.
And 26 years, so I think it's an interesting story.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the blessing in it, the third episode, I was actually in the hospital for 12 days. It was bad. My first episode, I was just in a couple nights, and I was with the team in 2 weeks.
Wow. So
we didn't lose a beat. I didn't miss a game. Just kept on moving. But this one was a little bit more complicated, and you could have never told me that it could ever happen. And as a matter of fact, I said to my family, I don't even know if I'm really have bipolar disorder because I haven't had an episode in 24 years. I mean, not at Michigan State, not at Duke. Just I thought, wow. And I guess the blessing was maybe this is what I was supposed to do, learn about my brain just a little bit more. Yeah. And then go into this life.
Yeah. I mean, that is an interesting way to think about it too. I know you talked about being a person of faith, not to say that the episode happening was ordained per se, but even in a way that it seems like as you are launching into this mode, it's also facilitating what you're talking about and even bringing a deeper level of understanding. And again, so many, scientific ideas are coming to mind, even as you talk about other hormonal changes, things like that, because something that people are looking at actively just in the way that the hormones interact and act in our brains and how the interaction, how it impacts cognition and mental health. So there's so many different layers there. again, I'm impressed at your insight and your introspection to be able to know those things as well. So
it's interesting.
yeah. Not to fast forward too fast, but to jump ahead a little bit and just also to talk about how that aspect of your journey is impacting what you're doing now. But I guess before we get there, I'm curious, how did it impact you as a coach after you came to this realization of having bipolar, navigating it, having the treatment, stopping the medication, going back on? How did that impact you on a daily basis, and even your perspective of yourself and of your teams?
Yeah, so that's kind of a long answer in a way too. When I was 26, 27, 28, 29, I was the toughest, most unreasonable coach you could, this is back in the day. Okay. This is where, discipline was everything. When I was diagnosed at 30, I became a better person, a balanced person, and the best coach I had ever been.
Wow.
And we won. Now we won before I was diagnosed, and we won after I was diagnosed. Championships, beat Stanford in the NCAA tournament, all these things. But the difference was my relatability, which I became more intuitive. I became more clear about my surroundings and what's around me as I worked to make sure I took care of myself and my child at the time, because my second child was born later. And I think that when I went to Michigan State, I was truly in my best self.
Wow.
I didn't even have a psych in the state. Wow. I worked out of my psych in Maine. I would see her once a year.
Wow.
And we would connect, and I would do my lithium levels and things like that. And I didn't have a therapist or anything. We were just moving along and played for a national championship in 5 years. And I use that cycle because that's a pretty quick way to get to a national title game.
Yeah.
And I was recruited by Duke. I went to Northwestern, but loved Duke. And so when I was recruited by Duke to coach, it was sort of like, wow, what an opportunity. And Gail had done such a tough job. I mean, an incredible job. And what I mean by tough, it was a tough to follow such a legend.
Yeah.
But the way I saw it was, perhaps I could be some kind of difference maker. Many people told me not to take the job because there was no movement upwards, basically. I mean, it was national championship or forget it. And I thought that was kind of cool. It's like, this is going to be great. And when I got to Duke, I just loved the team. There was wonderful talent. We developed wonderful talent. We inherited wonderful talent. We went to 4 straight Elite Eights. It was very hard to break through. We lost to Maya Moore in Connecticut. We lost to Brittany Griner. So breaking through the Final Four proved to be very difficult. And we recruited some great players, Chelsea Gray and Haley Gorecki and all of those. And but we, played at the highest level. And it was so exciting. It was met with so many challenges. I just can't even tell you. I mean, for so many reasons that make sense. It wasn't a rebuild, and I was still at my best self. And I think the thing that people may not understand is, as a demanding coach, you have your moments, often in the locker room at halftime, maybe after a game, yes, that too, in practice, closed doors, but I was my best self. And you have great relationships with players, and you have some that are not so hot, where you don't connect. And that's always sad because you remember those. Sometimes more than the ones that you do connect. But yet I also had to tackle a player with a panic attack. But see, I recognized that. I had education about it. And I wanted support from our team. I wanted quick access to psychiatry if needed. And so I pushed the envelope a little bit there, and we did different things, hiring a strength coach and all these things. But I will say that I was very fortunate to have some great years coaching and maintain balance by basically being kind of a boring person, to routine, family, having a dog, all these things in place. And that's why I worry about young people that don't have all these mechanisms you can really fight through for your children. Of course for your partner or spouse, but it's not the same.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's your children, and you've got to, step up and really stay with your routine,
Mm-hmm.
your swimming or whatever it is. But I think of young people today, what if they don't have those connectors, and they're not old enough to understand? I mean, I was 30 when diagnosed, and
Mm-hmm.
it drives me a lot to think about the loneliness that they feel, because I have definitely been there.
Mm. Yeah. So well said. I mean, I'm still just processing all the different pieces that you've pulled out, and getting to this last point of just the impact, and thinking about young people and those that you've navigated with and coached and mentored, the way that you were intuitive to it. But even something you said early on about how this made you a better coach and a better person, because some may have assumed that the way you characterized being disciplinary before was the most effective. But it sounds like there was another layer on top of that you're really able to tap into that kind of carried you through with all these different aspects. And just, again, I guess I'm going back to the community again. It seemed like it enhanced that aspect of community and the ways that you engaged in community, just in terms of perspective.
Yes, and you can trust again. After all the sadness, trust is a big issue, and not just trusting yourself, but trusting your players. It's no secret that we end up beating Stanford after I'm on meds, right? We do something incredible because there's trust and there's a balance of energy. Well, of course, I yelled at that team. Of course, I got upset with that team. But there's an overall respect and care. And again, through that journey at Michigan State and Duke, there's definitely been that respect and care. But the trust factor changes when you become diagnosed, when you can trust your doctors. Listen to your doctors. Don't go it alone. Now, I always say that the minute you think you can do it alone, that's exactly the time not to. And I just can't stress that enough.
Yeah, that's really, really important advice. And I think that's something that people need to hear, and need to hear over and over again, because in the moment, that tension will definitely come back in terms of trying to navigate alone, and to hear someone who has walked through it, and just to know the importance of staying connected and building that trust, I think is critical. I'm also curious, I guess I'm going to expand on the trust idea a little bit, and even make it bigger to a societal sense, because part of your story is also the aspect of being diagnosed early on, but not sharing it broadly, and the counsel that you got, versus what we're seeing now with a lot of people who are being more open about that earlier on to encourage others. But it's still challenging. It's still something for people to walk through. Where do you think we are as a society in terms of that trust? Are we giving people the space to walk in that, or is it just lip service and I don't know the best way to put it?
Yeah, I understand.
Glossing over in a sense. And that when it comes down to the real, how we really treat people, are we really walking the authentic trust, or just a facade? I know that's a way to, not to put all that on you, but.
Well, it's a selective space that we're allowed in. Upon going public after leaving Duke, I actually had a blog somewhere say how dare I could not share that publicly. I was shamed for not sharing. And the thing about it is that when I was given the advice by a doctor, the advice was extremely important, because it was said, and I believe this, that it would have all been about me. I would be in a press conference if I had gotten upset. Usually in games, I was pretty, on the sidelines, we're in the bunker together. So practices I was tougher in practice than game, right? You make practices tougher than you do game. But still, it would have taken away from them. They would ask questions. I would have been studied and looked at. And of course, the negative recruiting would have been incredible. So I think the answer is, in selective spaces, people can, if they're ready, share. But many times people still cannot share. And people said, would you go back to coaching? I wouldn't change what I'm doing. I do not take a salary. I'm raising money for a foundation. I have been working as hard as I've ever worked, but I do kind of pick my spots,
Yeah.
which is nice, and set my own, schedule.
Yeah.
I used to have a nice salary once upon a time. Not when I started in coaching, but later in coaching.
Right.
And so I do set my schedule, and it's wonderful, and it's coaching lots and lots of people. But if I wanted to go back into coaching basketball, I don't think I could, because it would take a visionary. It would take an athletic director that wasn't always looking over his shoulder, which most of them do. And I love athletic directors. I've worked for many fabulous ones, but I have to say, it's getting a little bit plastic in regard to Teflon. Everything bounces off. Everything bounces off of people. It's everyone's actually operating from fear. And so I don't think I would be hired back, even if I wanted that to be the case.
Yeah. And that's really poignant as well. I mean, I think to your point, that fear is there. I'm assuming you're talking about even without thinking about the mental health aspect. And so you add
I think
layer on and navigating. Yeah.
I just think that as a woman, I am not a bipolar coach. I'm a coach with bipolar disorder.
Exactly. Yep.
And that's a big distinction.
Yeah.
And frankly, I'm the best coach I've ever been right now at 57, coaching every human that is in front of me or giving me the opportunity. And I say coaching because I'm not a doctor. I'm not a therapist. I know a lot about CBT because it was used with me.
Right.
And so, I paid attention, and I've studied these dynamics of depression, anxiety, and how it manifests, and what the value of my swim is 5 times a week, and all those things. So I have some referent power that I think can be very helpful.
Yeah, I totally agree. And to follow up on that, what is maybe not a daily schedule, but what is the day-to-day look like for you? How are you doing that coaching at this point and integrating? I mean, as we're talking, I'm thinking integrating your coaching knowledge, your basketball knowledge, just your insights into mental health to this full kind of onset of tools that you can give people.
Well, it's interesting. I used to have my schedule set for me.
Yep.
and it's 7 days a week. It's our objectives 24/7. You know the drill. Okay, so that was that. Now I have to make sure and be more diligent than ever in creating my own schedule. That free time and idle time leads to ruminating. And with a depressed person, with an anxious person, with someone with bipolar disorder, and a person having a bad day.
Yeah.
And so scheduling my morning time, my writing time, my devotional time, that can't be missed. And initially I was missing that because I used to get up at 5:30 in the morning to have that time. And then of course I stopped getting up at 5:30 in the morning, but then I would roll through the morning and then I didn't do any of my thinking or my writing.
Wow.
And it took me a while to come back to that. So wait a minute, Joanne, this is part of who you are.
Yeah.
And so you schedule the days, you schedule things, and you spend time with the flowers, and you schedule time though to stay very busy. And my swim is 5 or 6 days a week. It's non-negotiable. I'm a member of the Y. I swim wherever I speak.
Oh wow.
Yeah. Especially if I can do that day of talk. That's really good. But my weightlifting, is not for vanity, although I like that I'm in shape. That's good.
Yeah.
But that's a very good, not only for bones, but for your mind, that's a good one.
Yeah.
And I talk about water therapy a lot, bathing and sweat is water. Sweat is really important. And eating, eating at roughly the same times, taking care of yourself. I don't even eat after 7:30. And people say, well, that's interesting. I said, well, I don't feel like it. My body doesn't like it, and it's a healthier way to live.
Yeah.
And so, it's not a pious thing. You learn this works.
Yeah.
Walking the dog every day, that's a really good thing.
Yeah.
Not to mention the dog liking it.
Yeah.
So it's not rocket science, but it is discipline. And it is awareness to yourself.
Yeah.
And if you're not sleeping well, you need to pay attention and make time for that, because it's critically important. And obviously I've learned all this.
Mm-hmm.
And if I could give this wisdom to whomever and just, cut short their learning curve just a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I wouldn't want people to have to go through what I went through if you can help them.
Yeah. And I appreciate hearing, I mean, it's so clear how your passion is spilling through in everything you do, even as you're sharing all these tips, even before you said to help others. I mean, I could just sense that you really want others to be able to get this so they can put these things in place and really have that full life, as you talked about too. And the importance of all those routines that you've mentioned, the dog walking, that's its own interesting aspect itself. So we had a couple of guests who came on and talked about social bonding and oxytocin that's released in our brain. There's some really interesting studies actually about people and dog interactions and how that also facilitates oxytocin. And so even what you're talking about just taps into a lot of those aspects of how it's good for us and for our brains in general. And just all the things you mentioned. I'm going to put a shameless plug in here as well, because my dad actually joined for one of the episodes because he's a sleep physician and just talked about so many specific aspects of sleep hygiene that you talked about, all the impacts that it has on mental health, and ways we can adjust and notice things that are arise. So, I mean, everything that you've mentioned just resonates in so many ways. And I'm so glad that you're sharing that with others as well.
Wow, you come from quite a family.
I agree.
You guys are pretty smart. I don't know. That's pretty smart stuff, getting through all that orgo. I'm impressed.
I had good role models. Yeah. But as I've shared in some other instances, it took me a minute to incorporate that into my own story. So that's a whole nother story itself in terms of the, what should we call it? The factor of putting myself into it versus the laziness. So that was a journey as well. But yeah, definitely have great examples from both of my parents, both from opportunities. They both grew up in Ghana, West Africa, but then also from their faith perspective and just the opportunities they created for us and letting us come to that space of learning to navigate. So in a lot of ways, it kind of ties in with the things that you've talked about, when you think about your children and how we pass those things along, but also create those opportunities. So, yeah. I know it's a tangent, but I had to go there because you brought it up.
It's a good tangent. That's a great story. I bet it would be an amazing book.
Well, I appreciate that. And I shouldn't give away too many secrets, but listeners don't know, but I'm actually thinking about the book project. So since you mentioned that, I'll just throw that out there and say there are things in the works.
Good.
But I'm going to pull now. My neuroscience is coming back in because, it's so helpful to hear you talk about all these practical tips. And I always think about how it impacts the brain. I try not to be too centric on the brain, but again, that's my expertise in the area of work. But I know that you have also talked about the importance of how we have to be able to understand the power of our brains. And so I'm curious what you mean when you say that and how you navigate that when you're sharing with audiences or individuals as well.
Well, I think that, a balanced brain is the smartest brain the brain can be, right? So we're all going to work for balance, and we all have different journeys to that balance. Mm-hmm. And for me, I've had to negotiate through my life. Again, being an athlete, I didn't want any foreign substance in my body. Mm. And I knew I could overcome anything. Mm. I've had to adjust. I've had to learn to listen. Mm-hmm. I've been on lithium since the first day I was diagnosed till now. Mm-hmm. I'm a big lithium advocate. I know that everyone cannot take it. Mm-hmm. I feel sad for that. Mm. I feel like lithium is the best drug and was, as you know, founded years, many moons ago. I had to learn about Lamictal, another powerful medicine, and I am a lithium Lamictal person. Mm-hmm. And they have played off each other. And I even gave birth to a son while taking lithium. Mm-hmm. And that there's very little research done on that. And that was obviously a different time and a long time ago. He was born in 2000. Mm. And so I feel like then I've understood what Klonopin can do. Mm-hmm. Certain things I don't like, certain drugs. Restoril is not my favorite. Mm. I could not do a commercial for Restoril. Mm-hmm. The addictive quality of it and getting off of it and the headaches. And I'm talking for me. I'm not talking to a listener out there who says, wow, that works great for me. Yeah. it's all very independent, but you have to be a scientist to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
You have to study. You have to wonder how these things can affect you. There have been times, I had kidney complications because of lithium. There was a pullback on lithium, but then that was premature. My kidney regentrified in a way that didn't make a whole lot of sense to medicine. So I've had some interesting complications. And I just think that if we're going to know our brains, you have to study all facets of it and recognize that alcohol is something I can do in very small moderation. But let's face it, I don't need to be drinking while I'm taking some of these medications. And I can tell you that Zyprexa is a mind-numbing experience that actually became necessary for me at one time. I couldn't believe the power of that drug. I love gabapentin. Okay, all-time favorite, just because of non-addictive qualities, helps you sleep. So, and then Klonopin is an all-time favorite because it works kind of quickly, and you can feel that. You can feel your chest. Anxiety is something I've had leading coaching. I've had more anxiety leading coaching than I did coaching in front of 30,000.
Wow.
It's really, again, it's really funny how things
There's
work.
more unknown there, I would say, than what
So
you were doing
Klonopin can be good.
Wow.
And I just throw those out there because you might have listeners that are in fact having to work with these medicines. But you have to be your advocate. You have to be educated. And when I talk with people and they're saying, well, I really don't know how much I take, I'm like, okay, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Go get your bottles. Are you kidding? You need to know what you're taking, how much. And again, you can't read, though, on the internet all these things. It's crazy how much, all these things that they say. So you stick with your doctors and you try to test them and learn from them. And so I guess your question was about, how we maximize our brain health and how we become educated about it. And I do talk to folks that have bipolar disorder, and I do remind them that Van Gogh and others of great prowess were known to have bipolar disorder. And I do tell them that means you have a brilliant mind, except you have to find your way through the maze to get there.
Yeah. Wow. That's so well said. That's so well said.
And I once had an athletic director tell me best compliment I ever got wasn't, oh, you won all these games. I had an AD and I love him. He said, you are super smart. and I said, yes.
Yeah.
And I can say that because I've been going through the maze.
Yeah.
And just when I thought I had the maze figured out, I was given a much more sophisticated maze.
Yeah. So. Yeah. Highly agree. And it just makes me think about, there's scripture passages about being tested, not being tested beyond what we can bear. And even just hearing that in your story and the way that you talked about all those pieces as you got to a certain level of understanding, as you're sharing that with others, and then another twist comes along the way. But Well,
the faith thing, I do want to interject because I feel so comfortable when I'm around people with faith because it's really important to me. And I started with John 14:27. And, this is all about fear. Do not let your heart be troubled, nor let it be afraid. And I feel like my whole life, for most of it, I've been afraid and scared about so many things I had to go through.
Wow.
And then as I transitioned, Esther 4:14, such a time as this, New Testament, Old Testament, coming together. And I realized that these tattoos I got them over 50. And I actually think that's a good idea. If you're going to get a tattoo, wait till you're 50, because then you'll know what you want to put on your body.
That's true. You've had a lot of time to think about it.
Right. And then when I have my tough moments, I do this.
Wow.
It's a form of this.
Yeah.
Like this.
Wow.
And for me, that has been extremely. And Esther, the book of Esther is extraordinary to me because she does everything she can. I feel like a lot of women, or men for that matter, but a lot of women could relate to the sacrifice and her savvy and her intelligence for what she accomplished.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so, and I appreciate your willingness and comfort in sharing that as well, because I think that's so been such an important part of your story. And that's a lot of what we've talked about on this podcast as well. Just the power of faith and what God allows us to navigate and through these different situations, and to make sure that that's an integrated conversation. Because in too many instances, just in conversations that I've had with people, where people are trying to separate those things. So I mean, that's something that's just coming through in your story, even as you talked about the medications, as you talked about the fear that you had to navigate and that you were acknowledging, spending time doing your devotions in the morning, and just all these different aspects. It's in a sense, I mean, it seems like it's an ongoing learning experience, and that's been the power. I mean, even as you were sharing about all those aspects, and I hope the listeners caught that too, about the mindset shift that you had about not wanting to put any medications in your body, to knowing that we do have these tools that can impact our brains and help us navigate. Yeah. But then we also have the tools that we can meditate on scripture that can also help us navigate. And again, my neuroscience, again, all those things impact our brains. And so I often feel like these are all the tools that God's given us to be able to move through and walk through these situations. So it's actually beautiful to hear you say that, and to
wait a minute. What's beautiful is that you're in academia at an Ivy League institution, being able to express the merging of all of these things. And I went to Northwestern, so I know what these worlds are like. And many times, faith is so pushed aside, and I just do not understand how everyone has their thing, right? Spirituality, karma, whatever it is. Okay, whatever you have, use it. But wisdom is got to be part of it. Okay, so if I get my wisdom from the Bible and Psalm or Proverbs, okay, if that's where I get my wisdom, where do you get your wisdom? I always joke I'm a Buddhist Christian.
I don't know if I've heard that before.
I sometimes I do, funny. Because of in reading about things, and I often do not talk about my faith, and I've been told not to talk about my faith if I don't have the right audience. And one of my things I'm looking forward to someday is to get on the stage of a church and really let it go. Like I don't know what I would say at that point. But you just feel like you'd be in a safe space. So I seldom bring faith into it. Although in Secret Warrior, the book, I have a chapter on faith. Because the way I come around to faith is almost comical. I mean, it's baptized over 50.
Wow.
Yeah. So it is kind of funny to me.
Yeah.
That's the way things happen sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to reading through. And actually, I mean, I'm always encourage listeners to listen to or read through, different products and books that our guests have as well. But I mean, to your point, I think it's been a positive shift over time. So I know I keep looping back to my dad, but when he was on the episode as well, one of the things that he shared was just the fact that we were having the conversation that we were having on this podcast that is published, broadcast by Yale in the public space, and how he would not have seen those things 30 years ago when he was training in psychiatry, and the way this shift has come. And then others who have come on the podcast as well and just talked about the importance of not dismissing people. And I mean, that's been one of our themes too, to just think about how we approach mental health in general and not be dismissive of any one approach. But that includes whether someone has a faith background or not dismissing an aspect that is so central to who somebody is. And so, I mean, for me, I did do some training with some clinical psychology interns in New York, and it was encouraging to see the way the field has shifted to say, okay, we need to actually understand people's life's experiences if we're trying to meet them where they are. We can't, the old school idea was that you don't talk about faith in therapy or certain taboo topics, but then how do you ignore a whole aspect of who somebody is? And like you said, the power that comes with that and the way that people navigate. So for me, it's been really encouraging to be able to step into these spaces, and then to also see people be receptive to thinking about things in a more integrated manner in our academic spaces, in our faith communities. Because for me, and my listeners have heard me say this before, to me, it's always distressing if there's dismission on either side. So if someone is coming from a purely scientific lens and dismisses the power of faith, or if someone's coming from a faith perspective and dismisses all that we know about science, even as you were talking about all those effects those medications have had, how they've been positive, we can't ignore that and pretend it's not there. So again, my listeners are like, oh, he's going off on that again, but it's a passion. I have a like-minded individual here with me, so.
Yes, very much so. And you said it extremely well. And in our world where there's so much separation, can we look for commonality? And if commonality doesn't match up perfectly, somebody believes in karma, great. But just wisdom. Can we all agree that wisdom is a good thing? And where do you get it? And I know the way I found it. I wasn't brought up in any kind of faith background, none whatsoever. So I know the way I came about, and we all need to find a way to come about with it. It's something that gives us wisdom.
Yeah.
Because life is too complicated.
Yeah.
You can't do this alone.
Yeah.
And so I marvel at what you're saying, and that gives me great inspiration for what the reputations are, out there with the ivory tower that doesn't relate on many levels. And then finally, I had a psychiatrist say to me once, which was really funny, when I was having a weaker moment, he said, "Do you have any faith? Is there any faith in your background?" And at the time I did, I was like, "Well, yeah." And he said, "Okay, let's review that." What's it all about? So I love that you're talking about the whole push-pull and how it can all work together.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a great segue to what I wanted to close with too, because you mentioned the hope that gives you. And I just was going to have you just share, what gives you hope on a day-to-day basis and in the place where you are right now in life.
Oh gosh, so many things give me hope. I mean, this podcast, I mean, your work and all of your colleagues and the direction we're moving. We haven't arrived, and of course we never arrive. And so it's a process, and we're in this process, but it's picking up steam, and the understandings are becoming more clear. And I feel I have great faith in people and the strength of people. And I just feel that we're churning to come together. It's starting to develop where we realize that all we have is each other and the human experience. And I think I feel that. I know when I speak, and I speak to different people, obviously, I'm thrilled if my story can help just a little bit. Yeah. And I'm particularly thrilled when it helps young people. Those young people that are just really struggling. I look at my son and losing almost 2 years at Northwestern and the pain that has caused him. And this going back to school is wonderful, except they're seeing what they didn't get. Yeah. It's sort of, and yes, we should not look backward. Absolutely. We should be present-minded. But young people can't always be present-minded. Yeah. So there's a lot of complicating things in our world right now, but I have tremendous faith in humanity. And I just hope to do my part. Well,
I think you definitely are. And I know, even in this hour that we've had, just the things that you've shared, I know definitely you doing your part in that way as well. And I know that this is really going to be encouraging to listeners. I imagine people will go back and listen to parts again, a lot of the nuggets and the wisdom just that you shared from your experience, the lessons you learned along the way, and how important that is in so many different ways. So I definitely think you're making that impact. I'm proud to be able to know you and have this conversation, even beyond the Duke part, although that was the foundation that entered the Duke mental health conglomeration entered into this space.
Duke.
Yeah.
Duke. Yeah, got a lot of that going on.
Yep. Which is why I got excited when I saw your background.
I got it.
Yeah. But again, I'm just so grateful for the work that you're doing, and even the way that you just shared so wisely and candidly in this last hour. I think it's something that people will really be able to hear, things that will resonate, insights that people will have. And so, for me, it's an honor to be a facilitator in a sense, to just be here and let people come and share all these pieces of knowledge and experience with our listeners. So deeply indebted to you for taking the time, for your investment, and for what you're continuing to do.
Thank you, Doc. I love docs. I love all docs. You guys do great work, and I so appreciate you having me.